Who she would call. You wouldn't have known more during that same year. You wouldn't have known. Hey, she needs to call Dr. Smith. But you would have known, hey, she could always call the dean of medical school, right? You would know that. Right? Yeah. You know, during that same year, you wouldn't have known, hey, she needs to call Dr. Smith at, right? But everybody doing okay? No one's falling asleep yet? I'm watching y'all. And like I said at the beginning, I'm just every once in a while gonna everybody doing okay? No one's falling asleep yet? I'm watching y'all. And like I said at the beginning, I'm just every once in a while gonna interject this. There's a lot of material to cover. I want to make sure that when the evidence comes up at trial and it's out of order, that you understand completely what I've got. And I want to make sure that in my opening that the defense is given notice of this is what I'm going to prove. So with that, so other than the stories initiated by Durst and Susan Berman, is there any other evidence that reasonably demonstrates that Kathie Durst made it back to New York, to the city, to the penthouse? The last person allegedly to have had contact with Kathie was Dr. Albert Cooperman, who was the Associate Dean of the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. Dr. Cooperman is yet another witness who you're going to hear from by videotape, by computer. Dr. Cooperman is almost 90 years old. He testified a couple of years ago. But you're going to hear him, and what he's going to tell you is he's going to explain to you that on Monday morning, there's evidence that he received a call between 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. from someone who identified themselves as Kathie, saying that she had diarrhea and would not be making it to school that day. Now, telephone records from the Durst 37 Riverside Drive penthouse for that Monday do not show any such call. Now, as a fourth-year medical student about to graduate, Kathie was no longer taking classes in medical school. So what you'll hear from the doctors who are going to testify is that the way things work at Albert Einstein is that the first 2 years you're basically in class. Then the next 2 years you are doing rotations. And that's how doctors figure out what they're going to do. They might do an orthopedic rotation, and they say, I really like orthopedics. And then they think, I want to be an orthopedist. I want to be an orthopedist at this hospital. So they do a sub-internship at that particular hospital. So Kathie was doing rotations her fourth year. And remember, this happens in January. She is going to be graduating in a few months, and she'll be off. In July, beginning of July, she would have started her career as a doctor. So on Monday, February 1st, Kathie was scheduled to begin her rotation at the outpatient pediatric clinic at Bronx Memorial Hospital, which is the same, that's Jacoby, just the former name. Dr. Sophie Bach, who ran the clinic, will testify that Kathie never showed up for the rotation and never called. She's going to tell you that in her 40 years, and I want to be clear, and this is what happens with these old cases. So she did not have 40 years of training medical students when this happened in 1982. But because she's testifying now, meaning now she'll be actually in court, she's able to now explain to you that, okay, in my 40 years, some before, a little bit before Kathie disappeared and some after, I've never had a student where this has ever happened, where they just never showed up, never called, not once. Dr. Peter Halpern, again, will testify, and he will explain the clinical rotations.
You're on a clinical rotation, you're not in a class, you're not even on the campus of the medical school, you're in some clinical setting at a hospital or outpatient clinic. And you're line of reporting and your relationship is with the teaching doctors at that service that you're assigned to.
Now that was going to show that one of the areas Kathie was very interested in for her residency was pediatrics. And as a fourth-year medical student about to graduate, you are given a fair level of responsibility. You're not a doctor yet, but in essence, you're being counted on as part of the team at this clinic. You don't just not show up. It's what the evidence is going to demonstrate. Now, they're going to come in, many of Kathie's medical school classmates, and they're going to tell you that she would have called, absolutely, the rotation itself to say, you know what, I'm not going to be here today. I'm sick.
Any medical student would know, especially fourth year, not the first day of the very first rotation in the third year, that the person to communicate that you're going to be absent with is the team that you're being assigned to as a clinical rotating student. And that they need to know that you're not going to be there, not just because you're sort of missing class, the way that might happen, you know, in anatomy, because you know that you're really part of a clinical team, and that you might have patients assigned, and that they need to know that those patients need to be reassigned, etc. And that's the person that you call.
So the evidence is going to show that even if Kathie would have, for whatever reason, called the dean of the medical school to say she was going to miss her rotation, it wasn't the dean who was expecting her. You're going to hear from all these doctors, they're all going to tell you that there's no way that you're not going to call the attending or another student in that class because in that rotation, because they're expecting you to be there, and Kathie is a couple of months from getting her letter. It's kind of like showing up, not showing up for something really important. You're going to then have to ask these people, can you recommend me for a spot here? So that's what the evidence is going to show.
Well, because medical students don't want the dean to know that they missed the day of a rotation, and there's absolutely no other way of the dean knowing. It's not like attendance is taken and that information is sent back to the dean's office.
So Dr. Halpern's going to tell you that, listen, for Kathie to have called the dean, it would be analogous to me calling the district attorney to say I'm not going to be at work today instead of my boss or whoever I'm going to be working with. And Dr. Halpern's going to tell you, as are a number of other physicians, just doesn't make sense. That's what the evidence will show. Now, during the original investigation, Dr. Cooperman assumed, and the investigators accepted it, that in fact it was Kathie he had spoken to on the phone. Now the evidence is going to show that that was an absolutely incorrect assumption. During the original investigation, there were certain important questions that Dr. Cooperman was never asked.
Your interactions personally with Kathie Durst over the course of her entire medical career were approximately 10 minutes, whatever.
5 to 10 minutes.
5 to 10 minutes.
Right.
Okay. Had you ever spoken with her on the telephone before?
No.
Had you ever heard her voice on an intercom before?
No.
Had you ever heard her voice on a recording of any kind whatsoever before?
No.
So, are you able to say, based on the voice, that it was or wasn't Kathie Durst?
No.
Why did you think it was Kathie Durst, Tom?
She said she was Kathie Durst.
She said she was Kathie Durst. So, other than a woman called with a female voice, and this person said they were Kathie Durst, was there anything else about that call itself that told you this is definitely Kathie Durst?
No.
So the evidence is going to show that Dr. Cooperman assumed that if somebody calls and says this is Kathie Durst and I'm not going to be making it to my rotation today that it was Kathie Durst. But when he was asked further questions, the evidence demonstrates that he had probably talked to her 5 to 15 minutes her entire 4 years of medical school. He never spoke to her on the phone. He didn't know her voice. That's what the evidence is going to demonstrate.
Have you ever been asked by any police officer, any detective, any prosecutor, have you ever talked to her on the phone before?
No.
Have you ever been asked by any police officer, any prosecutor, any detective, prior to meeting Mr. Lewin and I and Detective Shanley, have you ever talked to her on the phone before?
No.
Prior to meeting us, have you ever been asked, how long have you talked to her in total over the 4-year period?
I don't believe I was asked that.
Who was the first person or group of people to ask you those types of questions?
You and John Owen.
Now, the evidence is going to demonstrate that the reason that the dean was called was because Bob Durst did not know where Kathie was going to be that day. He did not know what hospital, he did not know what rotation. And you're going to get that information directly from Bob Durst during the 2015 interview in New Orleans.
If Kathie wasn't going to come in to, let's say she was unavailable, she was sick, etc. What you would have known is that she would need to call, the dean's office to say, hey, I can't come in, right?
She would need to call somebody.
Do you know who she would call? Do you have any idea?
No.
Now he expands a little more.
But you would have known, hey, she could always call the dean of the medical school, right? You would know that, right?
Yeah.
So if Kathie didn't make the call to Dr. Cooperman, who did? Shortly after the call to Dean Cooperman was made, and multiple times over the years, Susan Berman discussed the fact that she had made the call. She discussed it with a number of friends, and you're going to hear that testimony. Miriam Barnes was Susan's friend and neighbor in 1982 at Beekman Place in a very small apartment that Susan had in a very nice address, tiny apartment, great address in Manhattan. Miriam Barnes was another tenant in either that building or the next building. And she's going to tell you, you're going to hear from her again by videotape, what happened and what she remembers.
I got the phone call from Susan to come up to her apartment right away.
What exactly did she say when she was summoned in New York to her apartment?
She needed to talk to me.
Was there anything out of the ordinary about the way she summoned you up to her apartment?
There was a sense of urgency. She was, it took her a while to get it out. She was very nervous. And when Susan got nervous, she would pick at her lip. And she said, I did something today, and it's a bit of the body. And then her next statement was, if anything ever happened to me, Bobby did it.
Now the evidence is going to show that something was not going to happen to her for another approximately 18 years. But eventually, the evidence will show that the defendant cleaned up a loose end.
Eventually, at some point, did you read about, hear about in the media Kathie Durst's disappearance in New York?
Yeah.
And was it a big story at the time in New York?
Yeah.
And did you, that time period that you read and heard about it, was that generally the same time period that this conversation was? Like the same year?
Yes, of course.
Okay. within the same weeks.
Yeah.
Now, Marion Barnes' story is going to come out in an unusual fashion. The evidence is going to show that she doesn't first give the information to law enforcement. She has a friend who is going to testify, who she grew up with, who happened to be a reporter for the New York Times and also a lawyer. And that Miriam contacts him wanting to know what to do. And this is going to happen many years later. And he's going to testify that she was very afraid, and she came to him in confidence. She did not want to go to the authorities at the time, and she did not want her story told. You're going to hear further evidence that she did eventually tell her story to a New York Times reporter named Charles Bagley. And that Mr. Bagley ended up printing that story. And it was only after he had spoken to her friend had spoken to her, that we ended up speaking to her and getting the story that you just heard. Now, you're going to see Marion Barnes' testimony, and the evidence is going to show that this is not somebody who wanted to come to court, who wanted to share what she knew. You're going to also hear from Laraine Newman. Now, Laraine Newman has been a friend of Susan since 1976 when they first met in New York City. And Laraine Newman is also, for those of you who remember the original Saturday Night Live, she's one of the original Saturday Night Live primetime players. She's going to testify. She's going to tell you that she's a very private person, that she does not want to be involved in this case. She has never wanted to be involved in this case. But she's going to come in here and she's going to tell you what she knows.
The question, the way that she said it to you, was she in essence saying, hey, listen, Bob was with me, so therefore he couldn't have done this? Or was she saying it in the context of, basically, I provided Bob an alibi, whether or not...
No, she said she provided an alibi.
And in the way that she said it, was it in the context of that was an actual alibi or something she was doing for him that wasn't true?
Something she was doing for him because he was her friend and she loved him.
You're going to hear from a number of witnesses who are going to tell you a version that Susan told them about what had happened. And what the evidence is going to show is that Susan was very deliberate in who she told and in how much she told different people. And that depending on who the friend was, if it was somebody that would think badly about her for what she had done, she might not say anything. But the common denominator, what the evidence is going to show is she told a version of this story to more than half a dozen people. You're going to hear from Linda Obst. And Linda's going to testify about similar comments that Susan made to her. She and Linda go way back. Susan wrote, the evidence will demonstrate, a book that was basically, gosh, I'm sitting up here, I can't believe I'm blanking out on the name. What is it?
Easy Street.
Thank you. Easy Street, which was basically, it was the story of her father being a gangster and how she found out about it as an adult. And it became, was a big hit. Susan, again, as I had said, evidence will demonstrate, she really peaked very early. This came out in around 1980. And Susan, in the course of this, ended up deciding that she wanted to move to Los Angeles to become a screenwriter. And Linda Obst, who at that time had been a reporter previously, Linda Obst got into production. And this was basically Linda Obst's first project. She was brand new in film development. And what Linda was doing is she was working with Susan to develop the script based on Easy Street. Now, Linda Obst is going to testify. And Linda Obst, the evidence is going to show, is a major now Hollywood producer. the evidence is going to demonstrate that she's produced numerous movies that you've all heard of and likely seen. She's going to testify that she doesn't want to be here, has had her 15 minutes of fame, and the last thing that she wants is to come into court and testify in a high-publicity murder case. But she's going to tell you that here's what happened, and this is what Susan told me. She's going to say that during the course of working on the screenplay, Susan made what seemed like a very innocuous comment. And at the time, Linda's going to tell you that Susan was not easy to work with. And the evidence that's going to come out at trial is Susan was a very high-maintenance individual. She was someone who will be described as a very good friend, but as somebody that if you were her friend, she could be a handful. She was very needy. And Linda's going to testify that working on this screenplay was a nightmare. She's going to tell you that, you know what, it was her first project, that in hindsight, she should have had the strength to say, you know what, Susan, you can't write this screenplay, it's too close. But she said it was her first project and she made some errors. And one of the ways she's going to say she dealt with it was that she would somewhat tune Susan out. She would listen, but she would not listen sometimes as carefully. So Linda ends up remembering this innocuous comment. And this is what she remembers, and this is what she's going to testify to.
She once told me that she called Albert Einstein Medical Center for him and said she was Kathie. It came up in the context of she did the sorts of things for Bobby that Gladys did for Davy. And the example that she gave was that when Bobby was asked her to or needed her to, she made this phone call to Albert Einstein in Kathie's name.
Linda explained her motivation for testifying.
In terms of publicity for yourself, given your position and what you do, is this the kind of thing that is in any way helpful to your career?
On the contrary,
Can you explain?
it is not good for a movie producer to be associated with a murder trial.
And in the end, if I were to ask you, can you tell us, why are you here?
For justice.
Susie Harmon was another close friend of Susan's. They met when they were in the 6th grade. Susie is going to tell you what Susan Berman said to her.
He said something about there was something on the stairs and he was going to be, I just remember there was a stairway involved conversation and
You said he was going to be blamed. Did she, in discussing this, did Susan reference that it involved Kathie? Or her disappearance?
yes,
Okay.
they had a fight. Well, it was something about helping. I mean, it's almost like I kind of didn't want to hear it because it was something that she had done. It was like, why are you telling me this? She was telling me something very excitedly. And then it was not something that I could ask her too much about. You know, it was like, it wasn't like she just was telling me there was an accident. This is what I recall.
There
was an accident.
Okay.
Bobby was going to be blamed. She helped him so there wouldn't be blame.
I want to be clear what the evidence is going to show and what it's not going to show. The evidence is going to show that Susan told these people versions of the story that she had made the call to Albert Einstein to help Bob Durst. She was very clear in these calls, it's very clear in these conversations, that Bob Durst, or at least what she had been told by Bob Durst, was not that this was a killing, an intentional murder, etc., that it was some kind of accident, something that happened and she had to help Bob. So I want to make sure that you understand, the people are not going to present evidence that Bob Durst told Susan Berman, I murdered my wife, I need you to help me. What the evidence is going to be is Bob Durst killed his wife, and then he told Susan Berman that it was in essence some kind of accident, etc., and I need your help. And that's what occurred. Your understanding is that Susan is telling you that something happened with Bob and Kathie where she was not there, that involved an accident and a fall, and then she had to help Bobby afterward.
Right, and she said she had done something that would make it all right for him.
You're going to hear from Mela Kaufman. Now, Mela Kaufman, and I'm going to explain a little bit later in the opening what the relationship is, but just as a preamble, Susan ends up dating a man named Paul Cobb. And Paul has 2 children, Mela and Sarah. Sarah is older. They're teenagers, even younger when they start dating. When they break up, which again I'll get into in more detail, Susan became very close to both of those kids. Susan never had children of her own. So Mela was basically Susan's daughter. That's why she is in quotation marks. And Mela is going to tell you about a conversation that she had with Susan.
It was a story of one of her dear friends who I was familiar with, but probably had not met at that point. His wife disappeared, and she told it in a very sensationalistic way. And then, explained, again, generally detailed but foggy, that she had been the alibi, which was very common in my knowledge of her, right? That this was sort of part of her role in the world, that she would step in and show her dominance and power in the world by saving and helping people, and did not really have concerns with law. And so she stepped in as an alibi, and she told it in a sensationalistic way, and there was something about calling the next quote.
So though she told, again, some of her friends about the call to the dean, she didn't tell everybody. There are close friends that Susan did not discuss this with. And some of those friends are going to testify. And they're going to tell you that Susan knew me, who I was. And if she would have told me, I would have told her you have to go to the police. I would have looked down on her. And they're going to tell you that Susan never explained, never went into this situation with them. They're also going to tell you that Susan was very protective of Bob Durst. And this is something that she consistently related to their mutual friend, Nick Chase.
Susan said to me specifically that Bob killed Kathie, and I said no he didn't, and she said yes he did, and we argued about that, and she said, we love both of them, Kathie's gone, we love Bob, we need to protect him. Bob killed Kathie. I said, how do you know? She said, he told me.
A theme of these witnesses, particularly with Nick Chavin, is going to be that Susan made very clear to him on repeated occasions that Kathie's gone. We can't help her. We love Bob. He's here, and we need to protect him. Now, with other friends, Susan was less direct, but still communicated that Durst had killed Kathie.
And I asked her, so what do you think really happened? And she said, again, this is not a quote, so this is kind of the gist of what she said, but it was definitely something I remembered. She said, I'm a gangster's daughter, so I have different standards for my friends than other people do, and I don't have that many friends. But I think probably he killed her.
That was Danny Goldberg, who was a close friend of Susan's, who was a record producer. He and Susan had dated, and he again is explaining, I want to make sure it's clear, he is saying there, when he's saying, but I think probably he killed her, That's what he is saying Susan said to him. He's not giving his own opinion, he's just repeating what he was told. Now, with other friends like Robin Morse, Susan was so protective that she would not provide them with even Durst's name. Did Susan tell you that she had stuck with this close friend and him being accused of involved in his wife's disappearance?
Yes.
Did Susan ever tell you, or did she imply to you, that she had information about this friend's wife's disappearance?
Yes.
And what specifically did she say or imply or give you an impression about with respect to her knowledge of this wife's disappearance?
She simply told me she had the inside story.
And as you sit here, do you remember the exact words she used?
No.
These comments about the friend's missing wife and her statements about speaking to somebody about what had happened, did those come up near the time that she was murdered?
Yes.
Do you remember speaking to Susie sometime in December of 2000?
Yes.
And do you recall, during that conversation, do you recall Susan bringing up this issue with the friend's missing wife and the knowledge she had about the case?
Yes.
What do you remember about that?
I remember that she brought it up in the beginning of the conversation, and then, I was uncomfortable. I didn't want to talk about it simply because it was a hard thing to talk about, and she was getting more nervous. And I sort of tried to distract her, and she came back to it. And I finally said to her, Susie, what are you talking about? And she said, Robbie, I'd tell you, but your life would be in danger.
So where was Bob Durst, and what was he doing at the time that Kathie allegedly disappeared? So we go back to February of 1982. So remember, Kathie disappears. She's last seen alive at the party at Gilberta's on Sunday, January 31st. Monday, the evidence will show, was February 1st. Now, Durst told Detective Struck that he got up about 7 a.m. and that he left around noon. When he spoke to Detective Struck, he gave a very detailed version of everything that he did, which you will see. He said that he may have called his office several times collect. Now, phone records confirm there are 2 collect calls that were made from the South Salem residence, and those go to the business, the Durst organization, a subsidiary in New York City. Now, the fact that Durst called collect will actually prove to be significant evidence in this case.
Someone said that you used to call the office collect.
Oh, all the time.
Tell me about that.
I would call the office collect.
Why did you do that?
I didn't want to pay for it. Let Seymour pay for it. The only reason I'm calling is because he wants me to call.
Remember, Seymour is Bob's father, who at that time was the head of the Durst organization. The evidence is going to show that Bob is calling collect because Bob is cheap. Now, Bob's younger brother, Douglas, is going to testify that at this time in 1982, the only individuals who their office would accept collect calls from were he and his brother, Bob. Now, in addition, at the time Kathie disappeared, Durst provided Detective Struck, again, with this detailed account of his alleged whereabouts and activity. The evidence is going to show that Durst omitted a purchase Monday morning at the local Caldor store. Now, Caldor, you're going to hear evidence, was an all-purpose discount store. It was about the closest store of that kind if you were going to leave South Salem, where everybody knows each other, to where they were living at the time. And you're going to hear evidence that Caldor sold cleaning products. Caldor was about 20 minutes from the South Salem residence. Despite the fact that Bob Durst was able to give this very detailed version of everything that he had done, he never mentioned the trip to Caldor. There's been a stipulation that you will be receiving in this case that Bob Durst made a purchase at that store on February 1st. You're not going to have any information or evidence about what he purchased, but that's what you will have. Now, Bob Durst said that he returned to the 37 Riverside Drive penthouse Monday evening, and that he saw evidence that Kathie had been there. There was a Coke bottle on the table, and little things appeared to be moved. The newspaper had been brought in. Now remember, the evidence is going to show that the time Bob Durst is giving this statement to Detective Struck, he is still back on the now admitted lie that he had spoken to Kathie Sunday night after she had arrived home. Tuesday, February 2nd, Durst told Detective Struck that on Tuesday he drove to Connecticut to look at land parcels. And he's basically saying he's looking at land parcels for the Durst organization. Douglas Durst is the head of the Durst organization. Douglas Durst is going to tell you, he's going to explain to you whether or not there was any even possibility that Bob Durst, his brother, would have been looking at land parcels for their company.
Week after Kathie disappeared, on Tuesday, Bob said he drove across the West Chester Expressway looking at land and buildings. And my question is that something that Bob was doing at that time? So I wonder how you rate the idea that Bob was out looking at property across the West Chester Expressway. What would be your response? Because it's not true. And how certain are you that that would be true? Very clear.
So Douglas Durst is going to testify that he is very certain that's a lie. It's not true. Now, Durst added at the time that while he was in Connecticut on Tuesday, he called the office regarding business. We know from Bob Durst himself that Bob always called the office collect. However, on the Tuesday that Durst claimed to have called the office from Connecticut, there is no record of such a call. Does not exist. Did not happen. However, there were 4 collect calls that were made and accepted from southern New Jersey. Now, these collect calls were made from 3 payphones on the Jersey Shore, which is basically a 2-hour drive from the Durst South Salem residence. You can see South Salem at the top. There's Beach Haven. One of the calls was made from a laundromat. Now, the payphones were all adjacent to the Pine Barrens. For any of you who ever watched The Sopranos, the Pine Barrens is kind of famous. The Sopranos would always bury people at the Pine Barrens because the evidence is going to demonstrate that the soil at the Pine Barrens is sand. It doesn't freeze. And when you kill somebody in the middle of winter and you want to bury them, you need to have sand that you can dig into. So this is a notorious mafia burial ground. Now, in the week after Kathie disappeared, Kathie's sister Mary Hughes and Mary's husband Tom searched the Durst South Salem residence. They're going to say that while searching the bedroom trash can, Tom Hughes is going to tell you he found a piece of paper. This piece of paper has become known as the dig note. There is a stipulation. Bob Durst has admitted, by stipulation, he wrote that dig note. The note says the following: And what is on the right side is not what Mr. Durst wrote. That is just the translation of what's there. Town dump, bridge, dig, boat, other, shovel, or, and it says check, car, and it either trunk or truck rentals. Now, Mr. Durst was confronted about this during the last interview with Jarecki and Smerling on April 18, 2012.
Town, dump, bridge, dig, boat, other, shovel, or check, car, truck, rental. So this is my handwriting. Now, I have a feeling there's something out here. I have no idea what that means, what I was writing. And she found this in the trash around the time when Kathie disappeared?
Yeah. So,
And did she figure it all out? Town dump bridge. I don't even know where the town dump is up there. They collected garbage. We never took anything to a dump.
yeah, I mean, I concur what she said to the police was, well, this was the list that Bob made after Kathie was dead. These were his options on what to do with the body.
The town dump or the bridge or the dig, the boat. We had a sailboat on the lake.
I'm skipping a slide, Your Honor.
Yes.
And that slide I'm skipping, just for the record, is 255.
Thank you.
On Friday, February 5th, Durst reported Kathie missing to the 20th Precinct in Manhattan. When he filed the missing persons report, he described the jewelry that Kathie had allegedly been wearing. Diamond earrings. Now, Mary Hughes, Kathie's sister, is going to testify that Kathie did not have a lot of jewelry, but she did have a particular pair of diamond earrings that she wore all the time. She's going to tell you that about a month after Kathie disappeared, she would find these very earrings, the earrings that Kathie, according to Bob Durst, was wearing when she disappeared, that she would find them inside the Durst Riverside Drive penthouse. Now, on February 8th, the media got a hold of the story. So, remember, she disappears on the 31st. Bob Durst makes the report on February 5th. And on the 8th, let me back up. He made it on Friday. I need to do my math. 1, 2, 3, 4. If I said February 4th, he made the report on Friday, the 5th. And on February 8th, that's when the media first got a hold of it. And it was a big story. Now that same day, February 8th, this is only a week after Kathie disappeared. Karen Minatello, remember, she's the property manager of the East 86th Street apartment where Kathie is living. And she's going to tell you about an eerie discovery that she made.
They could tell me that the compactor was all jammed up, so I went down into the basement, into the compact room, and the porters were pulling out clothes, books, personal possessions that were jamming up and broke the machine.
And aside from clothing, you said, and books, can you tell me what else that you saw or that you remember seeing?
There was notebooks, there was, personal items, hair dryers, makeup, clothing.
Okay. And did you make an attempt to try to identify whose belongings those might have been in the trash compactor?
Yeah, I picked up a book.
Yeah. What type of book? Like a
I
notebook?
think it was a notebook or a textbook.
Okay. And what did that tell you?
It had Kathie's name in it.
Kathie Durst?
Yes. I'd never observed that before. When people threw out trash. Not clothing and books and those items items aren't supposed to go down the compact disc machine, like packs precious things. And
Okay, well,
together.
is it fair to say that during your many years as a building manager that you've dealt with jammed compactors before?
This is the only one I remember that was significant.
Okay, and why is it that you remember this one over any other incident?
I mean, who does that?
Does what?
Whose wife, whose loved one is missing and they throw up their stuff?
Now, the evidence will show that these items, Kathie's medical school books, Kathie's property, was thrown away, jamming up the compactor 1 week after she disappeared. Now, the evidence is going to show that Mr. Durst is the person who had access to that apartment and who got rid of those materials. And the evidence is going to further show that, unlike most people who, the stages of grief, denial, and anger, and bargaining, Mr. Durst went right into acceptance. She's not coming back. And the evidence will show that he threw those materials out because he knew Kathie was not coming back. Now, you're also going to hear from Elizabeth Jones. Elizabeth Jones was the cleaning lady for the South Salem residence at the time of Kathie's disappearance. Not to be confused with Janet Fink, who we talked about before, who had been the cleaning lady previously. So Elizabeth Jones is going to tell you, she's going to testify about a conversation she had with Bob Durst.
He throws everything of Kathie's out. All her medical books, her sewing machine, her clothes. He tells me, just take everything and do a junk job, just get it out of here. So I kind of felt like it was Christmas because I'm just going through the stuff going, I can't believe he's throwing all the stuff out. Who would throw all the stuff out? He threw everything out.
And again, Karen Minatello was the manager of the East 86th Street apartment. Elizabeth Jones is the housekeeper at the South Salem residence. So the two places where Kathie's spending time, East 86th Street, her stuff is thrown out. South Salem, her stuff is thrown out. And these include her medical books, things that she's going to need. The evidence can show, again, that Bob Durst knew Kathie was not coming back. On February 18th, Mary and Tom Hughes met Durst at his invitation at a Manhattan restaurant. Now, Mary and Tom are going to tell you that originally, they really tried to give Bob Durst the benefit of the doubt as much as they could. She's going to tell you that contrary to what Bob Durst had previously said to Detective Struck, he told Mary that he had not spoken to Kathie after she allegedly arrived back at Riverside Drive. That, based on what Mr. Durst reported years later, the evidence can demonstrate is the truth. But it also demonstrates that Mr. Durst, even when it comes to murder, doesn't make the effort to keep track of his various stories. And as you look at the evidence as it's going to come out with respect to Susan Berman and with respect to Morris Black and with respect to Kathie, it's going to be a continuing theme. Now, also contrary to what he previously told Detective Struck, Durst told Mary that when he arrived at the Riverside Drive penthouse on Monday, he had seen a dirty coffee pot. Remember, before it was a Coke bottle. Again, the small details, can't keep track of them. Mary said that as they left the restaurant, Bob Durst literally offered to let them have the 86th Street apartment. Now, this is February 18th. Kathie's been missing for 17 days, and Bob Durst is giving away her, it's a good rental, the apartment. She's going to say that she was completely unnerved by the timing of the offer. Now, while Kathie's family did everything they could do to assist in the investigation, within 3 months of her disappearance, Bob Durst quit cooperating with the authorities who were looking for his missing wife. Now, the investigation eventually stalled and was allowed to fade away. On February 7th, 1983, Bob Durst filed an affidavit with the Surrogates Court regarding Kathie's estate. The Surrogate Court is in New York. It's basically what you would do to probate an estate. So he's basically filing an affidavit dealing with, Kathie's assets. Durst made certain factual assertions under oath, under penalty of perjury. I have not disposed of any of Kathie's belongings or personal property, and the allegations to the contrary made in Mary Hugh's affidavit are false. Today, we know that's not true. I never threatened her life or threatened her in any way or assaulted Kathie or caused her any physical harm or abuse. The only testimony to the contrary is in Mary Hugh's affidavit, in which she attempts to relate an incident at a Christmas party, and that's false. Now we know, because you've heard Mr. Durst now admit it, that the abuse happened repeatedly. He said in this affidavit, under penalty of perjury, at no time did Kathie and I discuss divorce. The affidavit is just one perjurious statement after another, and that's what the evidence is going to demonstrate. Now, in late 1994, Bob Durst, as the oldest son in the Durst organization, so the way it worked was that Bob's father, Seymour, had become the trustee. The trustee is a very important member of the Durst organization because that person basically controls the trusts which control the Durst organization. And Bob's father, Seymour, was the trustee. And the way things worked in the Durst family is Bob, as the oldest son, was supposed to take over. But Seymour Durst and his brothers realized that Bob Durst was not suitable, and he was passed over in favor of his younger brother Douglas. Now this would lead to a level of hatred and hostility that Bob Durst continues to harbor to this day.
Always wanted to take my birthright, he wanted to run the company, he wanted to take my money, and he did those things.
In response, Bob Durst quit the company, left New York City, and moved to Trinidad, California. He did so without even telling his close friend, Nick Chavin, and another close friend, Doug Oliver, that he had left. He just took off and was gone. Yeah. I need a moment, Your Honor, actually. Yeah. Got to start up. Everybody still with me? Yeah. In 1981, Susan's autobiographical novel, Easy Street, was published, describing her life growing up as a mafia princess. In 1983, after selling Easy Street to Hollywood, Susan moved back to Los Angeles to become a screenwriter. With the proceeds from selling her book, she bought a house at 12030 Coin Street in Brentwood. In June of 1983, Susan married a man named Mr. Margulies. June of 1983. That would be the peak of Susan's life. She was successful. She was marrying somebody she cared about. And from that day forward, her life was going to head in a downhill spiral. Bob Durst attended the wedding.
Well, she got married, it went nowhere, but I walked her down the aisle to her wedding, and we saw each other frequently when I would be out there, but it's just different when you're not nearby. We used to see each other when she was in New York, and it would be a several times a week.
Now, although Susan was unaware of it at the time, again, this would be the peak of her life, Mr. was addicted to drugs, and Susan would reluctantly divorce him later that same year. The marriage didn't even last a year. In 1986, Mr. died of a heroin overdose. He would turn out to have been the love of Susan's life. In 1987, Susan began dating Paul Kaufman. Paul Kaufman was an old classmate of Susan's who she had met years earlier when they had attended what was then the Chadwick boarding school in Palos Verdes. Susan essentially became mother to Paul's young children. They were teenagers. I think Mella was a little bit younger. That's Mella on the right, that's Sarah on the left. And although she never formally adopted them, she basically referred to them as her children. Now, Paul and Susan invested all of Susan's money into a project Paul wanted to do, which was a stage version of the Dreyfus Affair that Paul was trying to produce on Broadway. There's an old saying, and apparently it applies to Broadway musicals, and it applies to horse racing. What's the best way to become a millionaire on Broadway? Start with $1 billion. And unfortunately, Paul Kaufman lost all of Susan's money. It never opened, and he lost it all. With Susan's money gone, Paul left her. But he kept his kids behind, and Susan took care of the children, even though they were not married. There's no legal relationship. So Paul left, Susan basically got the kids. By 1997, Susan had lost her home in Brentwood. And she rented a small, now run-down house at 1527 Benedict Canyon Drive near Beverly Hills. Now the sad part was, this was the same house that Susan had rented when she first came to Los Angeles in 1983, when the house was in good shape, when her whole career was ahead of her, when she was going to become a screenwriter. And now the house was down and out, as was Susan's career, and as was her life in general. This is what the house looked like the time that Susan was murdered. She was basically living in squalor. She had 3 dogs, and they were the love of her life. Witnesses are going to tell you that Susan continued to pay for expensive vet care and dog food that she couldn't afford because that was her priority.
You're saying you're saying the 5 or 6 years before 2000 you had been helped.
Yes, since the early 90s or so, she had managed to go through her trust money, and she was having very little money. Now, she was leading a very, very low-key lifestyle as opposed to what she usually led. And she was renting this yucky house, and I don't know what it was. Wasn't a whole lot of money, and she was earning some money for royalties, the Easy Street, or whatever you call it, she was getting. And she had sold a couple of what do they call them, treatments or something. Now, she wasn't getting a lot of money, but she was getting some. And I helped her maybe once or twice a year for each of those years.
How much did you usually get?
$25,000.
Now the evidence is going to show that Bob Durst was not generous with any of his other friends. But for Susan, he was giving her large amounts of money. And the evidence will demonstrate that he was giving her these large amounts of money because Susan had an important secret. Now, Douglas Durst, Bob's brother, was asked about the idea of his brother giving somebody a large amount of money.
You're asking, would my brother give large sums of money to somebody without an ulterior motive and interest? No, it doesn't sound like my brother would be giving large sums of money without an ulterior motive.
Now, near the time of Susan's murder, her financial situation went from bad to even worse. Stephen Silverman was a longtime friend of Susan's and a fellow journalist. When you first met Susan, what was her financial situation as you observed her to be?
Well, she had all the right clothes, and she had all the right handbags. She was living in this tiny space on Beekman Place, but it was cute and a good address. Later on, I think with the money from Easy Street, she bought a condo on Beekman Place. So there was money. I never quite knew. There were always rumors. You know, her father had left her all this money, but she didn't really live lavishly.
Well, I'm asking over time, was there a time when Susan ended up making you aware that she was having financial problems?
Oh, toward the end, she was in desperate straits.
Now, Silverman will describe Susan's financial problems near the end of her life.
Susan's financial situation, what did you know about that, especially towards the end?
Toward the end, it was drastic.
Yeah, tell me what you know about it.
Well, she called me, I got a frantic phone call, which I saved for a week on my voicemail. I even played it for friends. I said, what do I do? She was manic.
Okay.
She needed money. She wanted me to put her in touch with an agent. She wanted to sell the book. She wanted me to put her in touch with a Broadway composer.
When is this?
Had to be 1999.
Susan's financial situation, what did you know about that, especially towards the end?
Toward the end, it was drastic.
Yeah, tell me what you know about it.
Well, she called me, I got a frantic phone call, which I saved for a week on my voicemail. I even played it for friends. I said, what do I do? She was manic.
Okay.
She needed money. She wanted me to put her in touch with an agent. She wanted to sell the book. She wanted me to put her in touch with a Broadway composer.
When is this?
Had to be 1999.
Danny Goldberg, who you're also going to hear his conditional examination testimony, was an ex-boyfriend, longtime friend who had known Susan since the mid-'70s. Were you aware of Susan's financial situation with respect to her time with Paul Cobb?
Yes.
And can you tell me what you knew about that?
She was living with Paul Kaufman. I don't know for how long. It seemed to me like it was a few years. And she had a certain amount of savings and spent it, almost all of it, trying to develop a musical theater piece that never came to fruition, and that meant that she had very little money left.
Did Susan ever come to you for money?
She did.
And did you ever loan her any money?
I did.
How much did you loan her?
I think it was $5,000.
Now, despite Mr. Durst being someone who, you will hear evidence, was very frugal with his money, including himself, he sent Susan a check on March 3rd, 1999 for $25,000. Now, in late 1999, New York State police detectives secretly began reinvestigating Kathie's disappearance. They ended up getting involved in the case because they got a tip that ended up going nowhere, but the investigator who got it, it was enough for him to go back and start re-looking at the case.
So we know now in 2000 that something happened that piqued Janine Pirro's interest and got the Westchester District Attorney, Janine Pirro, interested in you again. Tell me about that.
What was it? Oh, there was new interest in me, and it was Janine Pirro, and the first thing I knew of it, was when there was an article in the Times and the, I don't remember if it was the Times and the Post or the Times and the Daily News, and it came out on a Saturday. I was usually the PR guy, he's still around, he's ancient, more than Matt's. He had been given a heads up by the reporters for the newspapers. And he had spoken to Douglas had spoken to Wendy had spoken to me, and there's going to be they're bringing up the disappearance And when it got to me from Wendy, it was that there were going to be newspaper articles. And we should meet with a lawyer. And why do I meet with a lawyer about newspaper articles? I feel badly for you people because it's going to be here in New York. It's a New York scene. But it's not really going to affect me very much in Trinidad.
And then did it turn out to affect you? How did it, when did
Oh, it blew me away. The divers and the lake and the lawyers told me. I really only had one lawyer, Joel Cohen with Strook, and he was their criminal lawyer. He was the wrong criminal lawyer for me. And he said, these people have huge budgets. The fact that they're sending divers into the lake in the middle of the winter, and they're taking a wall out of the house, that was in the newspaper article. I mean, they're going to do something. Janine Pirro's got to do something. I never heard the name Janine Pirro before. And I was told about Janine Pirro. Has higher aspirations, wants to run for something big, statewide. She's not going to go into the newspaper and announce that she's doing all this stuff. She's going to have to do something.
And do you know what piqued her interest originally? What got her interested in the case?
Well, I think it was initially a detective up there who got interested in the paper, and I think that there was some, what was it? They arrested a flasher, and he said, oh, let me off, I know all about Durst. And this detective went and started looking into it, who's Durst, and got the file from the New York City police, who can't think of his name, but
Timmy Martin.
Right, all right. So he started investigating and spending time.
Oh, sorry, the police officer was Joe Becerra.
That's it, Joe Becerra.
But the flasher was Timmy Martin.
Why? I'm pleased to say I never heard about it. Anyway, so it got upstairs to Janine Pirro, and they got this investigation, and this is a rich family, and she must have decided right away, well, this looks interesting. I'm just going to get publicity with this. I can get media attention. And she right away jumped in and kicked him out. He was getting the attention, not her.
Yeah, he came out of that Vanity Fair article at some point. It was a big picture of him, and there was another article in the newspaper about him, and so he got himself into Hollywood. Then I guess Janine Pirro did a press conference in November of 2000, I think it was.
Yes, right after the newspaper articles came out, Janine Pirro jumped into the thing and took credit for the divers and the rest of it and like that.
And what were the divers for?
They were, on Lake Truesdale. I mean, she never said, but obviously they're looking for body parts, looking for something to use as evidence.
So the position was that they were trying to reopen the case.
They were reopening, and we have evidence against this rich guy, Durst.
And what was your reaction to that when you heard it?
Oh, the article blew me away. In addition to, I had a loft on Green Street, which I kept, and I also had a house up in Ridgefield, Connecticut. And I was told by Wendy this was happening, and I should come here to New York so I could meet with a lawyer. I went to New York. I wasn't really sure I was going to meet with a lawyer. I mean, just to read a newspaper article. Why do I go to a lawyer with a newspaper article? I came back to New York, and I went to my house up in Ridgefield. Saturday morning, I got up and went down to the Starbucks, got the New York Times, whichever other one, and it blew me away. Absolutely, totally blew me away. I wasn't the least bit concerned about the details. You searched the lake until you're blue in the face, and you took a wall out of the house, ridiculous. I was concerned when Joel Cohen said that she's going really far. DAs don't usually start making announcements in the newspaper when the police haven't even charged you with anything. And he said that she's going to go and do something. And then I met with him, and do something was obviously she was going to have to charge me with something. She couldn't just investigate me and drop things. She'd have to charge me with something. And he was asking me endless questions about some stuff that happened 20 years ago, rumors back and forth, and this and that.
All right, that will conclude court for the day. Ladies and gentlemen, do not converse among